Hi, everyone. We will be talking today about the distinctions between archival collections and computational corpora, which we'll define in just a bit. Just looking at the differences and what we might be able to learn from computational corpora as language documentation folks. First of all, I want to thank everyone who worked on this project. It was a pretty big undertaking, and we're continuing to do other parts of this through the Historical Linguistics Lab at Yale. So first, let's address the definitions. What is one and what is the other? And we'll look at why they're made, and that will kind of explain, further explain what the distinction might be. So archival collections are made for future and contemporary reclamation projects as deemed fit by a language community, doing things like facilitating pedagogical material creation, etc. Computational corpora, on the other hand, are generally made for a specific purpose, such as publishing linguistically annotated materials or massive databases, which is kind of the prototypical example that we see. Really importantly, the guiding principles of archives is that they are free of charge and they attempt to optimize accessibility. And we have another presentation here about findability for archives. Corpora, on the other hand, are for larger sets of language materials, often having an emphasis, again, on NLP. And there is often a motivation of profit. These aren't in opposition directly, but they do result in methodological trajectories that are distinct. This slide basically just has some examples of what you might find on one versus the other. So archives are for language documentation, reclamation, and description, whereas corpora are for accessing materials. Often it'll be in some kind of portal with a search to find specific pieces. So first I'll talk about, in terms of specific features, the interface and interaction with the websites. Specifically, I'll go over search and documentation, that is instructions on sites. There's other things to talk about, but we have a small time limit here. So first, querying and searching. I think a lot of people complain that archives have a far inferior search capability in general compared to larger corpora. And we might start by looking at what the goals of archive searching and corpus searching are. And ultimately, archives, when you're looking for things, you're trying to download texts or whole collections of texts and related items. Whereas in corpus searches, you're looking for texts, strings within texts that are filtered in some way or another. It seems that corpora, though, do allow a bit more filtering, although with both you can filter on metadata. And both have wildcards, but corpora have often better wildcard functions, such as regexes. There's also an issue of indexing sensitive data, where you wouldn't want to be able to find certain pieces of metadata with archives, whereas corpora often don't take that kind of thing into consideration. So it seems like there's just different uses. However, archive searches are indeed often less robust. With regard to documentation and instructions for using these sites, it's completely necessary. Otherwise, we won't be able to access things. It's kind of unintuitive if you don't have that. So they need to be easy to find within the website and easy to follow, and they should document information about the information that's in it and also about the repository's shape as well. So how are all the files organized, and how are things displayed, what we can look for, as well as citation information and what things we can use, the certain aspects of the archive for. Some corpora and almost all archives will need to provide instructions for depositors. Some corpora do involve depositing, but most are static, whereas archives are inherently about having depositors. And as we'll see in the next few slides, archives do seem to have much more of a focus on the depositor than people trying to access things, which is interesting given that part of the intent of an archive is for people to be able to find things as people rather than machines. So focusing on the idea of a user interface. So just 3 examples of archives and where you'd find their docs. The red circles are where you'd find links to things that are important for understanding how to use the sites. You'll notice on Paradise that there's 3 different links, And so it's a bit of a wild goose chase if you want to try to figure out which parts you're actually trying to use. In all of these cases, they discuss how to deposit and maybe who to contact with registration information and some amount of a search guide. Ultimately, though, these searches, again, maybe there are Boolean functions and maybe a few wildcards, but there's not much capability beyond that. Again, very focused on depositors rather than accessors. So on the other hand, we have corpora, and looking at Childes, that one does have information for depositors, but it is also, there's lots of information for accessing things. That red circle is over 4 different things because it is kind of decentralized. Finding the information is a bit difficult. On the other hand, we have the Icelandic gigaword corpus, and the user guide only exists in Icelandic, which is an interesting asymmetry because the corpus itself, the corpus interface itself has both Icelandic and English capabilities. But it is very clearly displayed, and the guide is very thorough with how to search and what kinds of things are possible. The Afroasiatic corpus has a very thorough guide about data formats, how to open all of the kinds of things you can download in various softwares, such as Elan or Prat, and trying to get access to the actual data is found elsewhere, the information for that, but it is clearly stated where to find that. So very, very much in all of these, access is key for the documentation.
Thank you, Sunny. So apart from issues about using repositories, we also have concerns when we consider the social aspect, in particular, when the data, which is language, come from people. So we'll address 3 of them, but there are also concerns that we won't be able to cover them today. So the first one is data sovereignty. There is a difference between archives and corpora. So one can get items taken down from archives relatively easily, but for corpora, it is often owned by someone else and they're protective of it. In the archival process, it is common to practice memoranda of understanding. So they are not legal binding, but they are about the relationship between people working together. And so, for example, speakers may let the creator of the archive know which part of data might be problematic and needs to be taken down. So this requires continued conversation between the owner and the speakers, regardless of the who own the archives. But such practice is rarely present with corporation which own the corpora. And it is not even always present with reclamation project, which might include people, researchers from outside the community. And the differences might also be related to the distancing to the data. So although both archives and corpora will involve some kind of distancing, their degree is different. So for archives, the depositors have control over the archival collections. They are someone who work directly with data, whereas for corpora, the people who have control over the data are people who are building the presentation of the data rather than people who directly collected the data, which means that for corpora, they are someone who collects data from secondhand sources. So what we see here is both involve different kinds of distancing of the data from the original people with whom it is associated. And the second concern is ethical principle, in particular for personal considerations. So whether access to part of the materials is limited due to ethical concerns. So for archives, such ethical consideration is can often be found because data come from elicitation in linguistic fieldwork, and they may contain personal information of the speakers. So in practice, archives like the California Language Archive would limit access to those parts of data. And also because archives contain demographic information in the metadata, consent from the speakers will be needed. However, such consideration might not be found in corpora because the data might come from materials available in the public domain, like newspaper or books. So what we see here is the ethics of archives and corpora may vary because of the data source. And the final one we'll address is access and profiting. So archives are designed community-based, and they are intended to open to the whole community. So they are mostly open access for all users. And the data is linked to individuals who typically retain some moral rights of the data. And they are not commercial, they do not make profit. On the other hand, for corpora, while some might have open access, like universal dependency tree bank corpora, but some of them might have restricted access, like Sketch Engine, which is commercial. And whether a corpus charges may depend on a variety of factors, like who hosts the corpus, whether it is hosted by institutions or by private companies, and also the maintainers, whether new data are created regularly, and also the users, whether they are commercial, institutional, or individuals. So what we see here is the difference in accessibility between archives and corpora may stem from both the cost and also the purpose of the repositories. And here we'll briefly mention an example that may illustrate the factors that play a role in determining whether a repository may charge. So this pan-Chinese corpus, LIVAC, has two versions. It's a basic version with open access but limited data, and also the advanced version whose access is restricted but with the full set of data. So what's interesting about this case is that the host of LIVAC has been changed. So before 2013, LIVAC was hosted by university when full access was free. But after 2013, it is hosted by a private company when full access may be charged, which would also depend on who the users are. So now Sunny will give the concluding remarks of this presentation.
Right. So it seems like through this presentation, we've noticed a couple major features, or rather areas where these differ, and maybe this is a reason for why we might view one thing as having different things that are admirable, but perhaps it's a bit of an apples and oranges thing. So in terms of ethics, it seems like corpora often limit ethics to licensing concerns, and it's possible that this is due to the distance from the data source, which is just an inherent issue with corpora. Sometimes, though, we'll have corpora that we see that are built explicitly for language reclamation. And in those cases, often there isn't such a distance, and there is very tight concern for ethics. It seems like people in language documentation are more protective, and we structure collections more conservatively. This can end up becoming a bit of a hypercorrection, and it ends up making access difficult. In terms of user experience, archives really are working with much less funding, considering how much information they're storing. So some features may not be feasible to implement, such as a very thorough search engine or something like that. But we at least know that, okay, this is an issue, we don't have all that money, so that's an explanation even if we don't have a solution. So we can look to solutions, and I would love to hear something from y'all. As for recommendations that we can maybe consider as actionable, we should maybe look out more for people who are accessing the collections, not just those who are depositing into the collections. We can maybe valorize some investment in keeping a good UI and looking out for dead links consistently, because that is a common issue when we were trawling through various archives. The advanced search features of corpora could be implemented in some ways, maybe less expensive ways, but some ways nonetheless making better wildcard usage, being able to filter a bit more effectively, and making better guides for the repositories. So something about the actual structure of how it's stored. So just, what are folders, what are collections, what are files? For depositors specifically, some guides that would be centralized in one location that would be printable formats so that they're consistent and versioned as things grow in the archive would be very helpful. And for people trying to access things within the archive, having a search guide with screenshots that are very explicit and information about file types, like what you saw in the Afroasiatic corpus, would be very helpful. So ultimately, it really seems like reframing our thinking about archives to be a bit more about those who are accessing the collections would help quite a bit. Now, that said, there's a lot of examples of corpora and archives that we haven't considered because there's just so many of each. So if there are examples that you have that would be helpful for us to consider, we would love to be involved in such a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.